Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Lindsay Clancy trial. I know that I said on TikTok I was tapping out. I know that I had a bit of a crash out on TikTok, which was probably against my better judgment. I could have reacted better. But this case has been particularly frustrating with people not really doing their own research. And I decided that I was going to try and be a voice of reason somewhere in this mess, the way that I was with the Epstein files. And that's kind of how I ended up here. So last night on my TikTok live, I watched the first 2 hours of the trial, day one of the trial. And I know that I'm late to the party as far as this is concerned, but I also work a full-time job and I was trying to stay out of this mess. So just forgive me for being late. Also, forgive me for putting other projects on the back burner. I feel like every time I tell you guys that I'm going to do something, something else happens or comes up that I do an episode on. So forgive me, but that said, I do want to keep as open of a mind as possible and really approach this from as objective of a standpoint as I can. My stance personally is that Lindsay is responsible for the crime, point blank, period. To be honest with you, I will not be entertaining any of the conspiracies surrounding Patrick because they are completely irrelevant to the trial itself, and I'm not going to feed into those delusions. In this episode, what I intend to do is provide commentary on what has been presented so far in the first 2 hours that I saw, as well as additional research surrounding core concepts within the case, such as the psychology of a female family annihilator, the psychology of postpartum depression and psychosis, how crushed up medication enters the bloodstream faster, the psychology of suicide and whether people use multiple methods in a singular attempt, as well as other topics of discussion if and when they come up. So if you would like to participate in the lives on TikTok, follow me over there. It's under the same platform name. I will be posting on my little bulletin board when I intend to go live. Right now I'm thinking about doing it Saturday nights and Sunday nights. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. First and foremost, I want to lay out the primary notes of each side's argument. So the prosecution is attempting to present a case of premeditation and negate proof or evidence that Lindsay was experiencing any sign of mental defect that would remove criminal liability or culpability. The defense, however, is angling to prove that Lindsay was not of sound mind at the time that the crimes took place. And in order to support their argument, the prosecution posited a narrative in their opening statements that Lindsay wanted full control over the kids and the family, which was part of her motivation for murdering Cora, Dawson, and Callan. However, they also simultaneously posit that Lindsay was so overwhelmed with the idea of being a parent, she consequently killed her children to escape from this. And these two ideas are fundamentally irreconcilable. So the opening statement for the prosecution does little to explain its own contradiction. For instance, how someone who allegedly didn't want to parent would then jump to committing triple homicide, or how a person who allegedly liked parenting so much they wanted to be in total control of the kids would then commit triple homicide. The prosecution also went on to posit that Lindsay was doctor shopping. However, they did not disclose the reasons behind this behavior. The prosecution also framed this behavior as a refusal of treatment on Lindsay's end. During this process, during opening statements, the prosecutor talked at the jury and was really speaking in a way that was kind of detached because she read almost exclusively from her notes and quite honestly appeared relatively disinterested in what was happening. And in my opinion, she came across as completely unprofessional. Some people may say, oh, well, it's just internalized misogyny. No, when I looked at her and I watched the way that she was speaking to the jury, I didn't take her seriously. The hair bow is stupid. She looks like she has not brushed her hair. Like, she does not scream professional to me. And the way that she talks, especially in the opening statements, makes it feel like this is the first case of this caliber that she has ever prosecuted before. And I really feel like it's doing them a disservice because in the opening statement, she also repeats herself several times, which, devil's advocate, may be a tactic to ensure that the jury is listening and they're not missing things. However, this can also come off as her believing that the jury is incompetent, which may not be received very well by the jury itself. Comparatively, the defense posited that rapidly changing prescriptions and doctors accelerated Lindsay into a mental health crisis, resulting in triple homicide when she already had underlying issues. The defense, on the flip side, actually spoke to the jury, not at the jury, and appeared open and casual in their demeanor and was much more professional and well put together. It was almost like having a conversation over dinner. It was much more interesting to listen to and engage with. Additionally, the defense also presents Patrick as an involved father, which is not something that the defense has to do. In fact, they could be pointing the finger at him saying that he sucked and that's why Lindsay ended up the way that she did. But it speaks volumes to their argument and their character to build Patrick up when they could very realistically, push the angle of, well, he was such a terrible father. He's actually kind of what caused Lindsay to do all of this. Now, the primary arguments and evidence presented in both opening statements is worth dissecting. So first and foremost, I want to talk about the defense's evidence presented in opening statements because I think it's very compelling to a certain extent. The defense shows a photo of Lindsay's self-harm injuries, and what we can see in that photo are about 3 or 4 very shallow cuts, almost kind of like a paper cut on the forearm, and then there is one final cut further down the forearm and away from the wrist that is wide and deep. Now, I myself am not a medical expert. I want to make that very clear. However, I have dealt extensively with people that partake in self-harm, and the initial marks appear to be hesitation marks, whereas the last cut is very deep and very intentional. This is indicative of someone intending to harm themselves, and the hesitation marks are often a sign of someone seeing how an instrument will cut or working up the courage to commit the act of physically harming themselves in a way that is going to be rather painful. We also have a photograph of the cup in which Lindsay's medication was ground up in. Now, I know a lot of people on the internet are spouting off conspiracies that Patrick ground up the medication and gave it to Lindsay because nobody grinds up medication to commit suicide. And what we're forgetting is that Lindsay has a medical background. Although that's not really necessary for this next tidbit because as far as I know, I thought this was common sense. But grinding up pills allows them to enter the bloodstream faster. If somebody is truly intending to kill themselves, this would be a much more effective and efficient way of doing it than just ingesting a handful of medication, hoping that it works, and waiting hours for it to be properly absorbed. Not to get too personal, but a friend of mine, their child tried to do something similar, and it took hours, an extensive period of time to have the intended effect. They're doing well, they're in recovery, they're fantastic. But case in point, right? Somebody who knows how to make medication act faster is going to do something like that. Also, it is much easier to drink a powder mixed in a beverage than it is to try and take handfuls of multiple pills. It's just easier, Efficiency, not to say efficiency is key, but it just makes sense. So that said, the grinding of the pills could be an indication of premeditation, at least as far as the suicide goes. It wasn't like she gave her kids sleeping pills, so just that she was putting a lot of thought in the suicide. The internet has also latched onto the idea that Patrick may have pushed Lindsay out of the window, which doesn't make any sense given the Jefferson fracture that the defense brings up in their opening statements. Anyone not intending to die and is pushed out of a window is going to move their body in a way that protects their more vital organs or breaks the fall. It was something that I talked about in my video and episode on the crash, where even though even though she was driving into the wall, the car was positioned so that Davion and Dominic got hit more than, I can't even remember her name, which is honestly okay because fuck her, but she did not receive the brunt of the impact, which is good for her, but not for them. So, something similar here, right? If Patrick is going to throw Lindsay out of a window, she's going to want to try and protect herself. She's going to twist or position in a way that she's not going to dive headfirst into the concrete. That just doesn't make sense. So, being pushed out of a window, if you're not intending to die, like I said, does not lead to someone diving headfirst into the pavement. However, if your goal is to commit suicide, diving headfirst into the pavement is a much more practical narrative. Of course, this may depend on the drugs that were taken as well as the effect, but the trajectory makes much more sense from a narrative that Lindsay threw herself out of the window instead of being pushed out of the window. Now, I was informed on Live that part of the reason people are speculative surrounding the crushed up medication is that Lindsay used lemonade to wash it down. And the internet has really run with this narrative and stated that it makes no sense that Lindsay would put her medication in lemonade because Lindsay is a nurse and she should know better, which is a little counterintuitive when you then say, well, she wouldn't have crushed her pills up when a medical professional would know that that would be more effective. It's a whole thing. But I wanted to fact check this narrative. And while in some cases lemonade can have, can affect the potency of medication, it's really not that big of a deal. It does not have that significant of an effect. In fact, the changes they really don't do anything. The noted concern in the studies that I saw is specifically with grapefruits and grapefruit juice because it has a vastly higher acidity content than lemon juice. Additionally, lemonade in general does not have a super high lemon juice concentration, whether that's homemade or store bought. In fact, most store bought lemonades only have about 10% lemon juice content. The highest one that I saw was, I don't even remember the brand, but it was a niche type of lemonade that had like 19%. And while that sounds like a lot, what this means is that if you poured a glass of lemonade, most glasses don't even have a full ounce of lemon juice in it. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the effects of the lemon juice, if any, aren't going to be enough to combat the large dose of medication that was in the beverage. So that narrative in and of itself is a little bit ridiculous in my opinion and could have been solved with a little bit of a Google search, which is what I did. So there you go. Now, what about the argument that Lindsay was shopping around for doctors? Well, this really isn't the big evil thing that the prosecution attempts to make it. As someone who has been to a psychiatrist, who has worked extensively with mental health professionals and taken plenty of psychology courses, it is completely normal for people to try several different doctors and psychiatrists in an attempt to find treatment that better suits them. It is no different than trying out multiple therapists. This is just something that people engage in all the time. It doesn't mean that they are just rejecting treatment. And based on the evidence provided, as well as Patrick's testimony, it's clear that the care Lindsay was receiving at this time was not beneficial to her. So naturally, she was going to look elsewhere. In fact, one major point of concern in the evidence and testimony provided on day one is how rapidly Lindsay's medications were changed. In most instances, medications are adjusted slowly and altered every few weeks because any good psychiatrist, any good doctor wants your body to adjust and adapt. Obviously, there's a little bit of wiggle room, right? If you take a medication and you break out in hives, they're not going to make you take that for a couple of weeks. So that said, use your deduction to kind of sift through how accurate Lindsay's behavior was. In my opinion, it makes sense, but I will leave that up to you. Now, based on the chart that the defense provided, it doesn't appear to be the case that this was every few weeks. In some instances, from what I could see, it was every few days. So the idea that she may have been overprescribed drugs is completely plausible. Unfortunately, amongst some professionals, there is also this sentiment that medication is going to solve somebody's problems. And this isn't a practice based in reality, right? People still need help through therapy, through coping techniques, other behavioral health techniques, etc. And sometimes that's in combination with medication. But medication itself or a pill itself is not going to be the complete solution. So I myself have ADHD diagnosed and I have an anxiety disorder. Personally, for me, what helps me with my anxiety, one, is exercise. That is something that I specifically do because I cannot specifically rely on the medication to solve all of my mental health problems. That's just not how it works. So it really seems that based on what was presented by the defense, that they were throwing medications at Lindsay hoping that they would work without really getting the underlying issue. Also, it is very reasonable for a person to resist medication if they are experiencing side effects, which may have been partially what Lindsay was experiencing because no medication is going to fit everybody with every diagnosis under the sun. So everybody with bipolar isn't going to get the exact same medication because every person is different. And I personally had to stop taking my ADHD medication. It was methylphenidate because out of the blue, it started giving me side effects that I did not like. And I had to go to the psychiatrist that I saw at the time, who I eventually stopped seeing. So the methylphenidate, what it was doing is it was making me incredibly aroused, horny, if you will. And that was not something that I had ever experienced in the years prior that I had been taking it. I don't know what triggered the change, but I went to her and I said, hey, I'm really uncomfortable by this. I want to try a different medication. She basically laughed at me, made fun of me, and I was like, cool. So I'm going to wean myself off of this because you're not going to be helpful to me and I'm never going to see you again. And that's pretty much what it was. And it sounds like that may have been similar in Lindsay's case. So, quite frankly, within the first 2 hours of the trial, the prosecution looked like a joke because, on top of their line of questioning with Patrick supporting the defense's argument, they made multiple contradictory statements. And the prosecution established that Lindsay had 2 very traumatic births. Thankfully, the third one went well. However, each time she was anxious about returning to work. So, clearly established pattern of behavior. And this is very normal for mothers. Mothers who have an infant at home, they're not keen on going back to work. It's called like the baby blues or something. It happens all the time. Yet the prosecution establishes that Lindsay didn't want to go back to work. Lindsay didn't. She was very much adamant on staying home. And then they posit that this may have led to Lindsay killing the kids because she didn't want to go back to work. However, Patrick tells them that he had put money aside to support Lindsay if she wanted to stay at home longer. So there would be no reason for this narrative to be true. There's no, if this is accurate information that Patrick is presenting and they have the money to allow Lindsay to stay home, and the prosecution is saying, well, she killed the kids because she didn't want to go back to work and wanted to stay home, there is fundamentally no problem because that is something that she could have done. Additionally, Patrick discusses their hiring of a nanny, which again contradicts the prosecution's sentiment, especially in opening statements, that Lindsay murdered the children because she wanted complete and total control over them, as well as how they were raised. This is also despite the Clancy's history of using nannies and babysitter services well before this. So, again, contradictory. Patrick discusses releasing the nanny from work and states that it was because they had no need for her since Lindsay was already staying at home, which again contradicts the prosecution's sentiment that Lindsay didn't want to go back to work. Well, they aren't keeping the nanny because Lindsay's just going to stay home and take care of the kids anyways. So I'm not entirely sure what the prosecution's argument is, and it doesn't really seem like they know a whole lot, to be honest with you. Then we had the prosecution establishing through a line of questioning that Lindsay has a history of insomnia and trouble sleeping. However, they attempt to refute this by asking Patrick if he had watched Lindsay while she was sleeping to know if she was really suffering from insomnia. And if you were on the live last night, you would know that this question was so laughable, I had to pause the stream because I could not believe it came out of the prosecution's mouth. And quite honestly, I'm surprised that nobody in the courtroom broke. Like, I would have had such a hard time not laughing my ass off there. So, already, not really sure what's going to happen there. And we haven't made it very far into the trial itself, but based on what I've seen within the first 2 hours, I feel like the prosecution is confused in what its own argument is. And I think that comes from a lack of understanding surrounding some key psychological issues. So, as mentioned, I went ahead and did some research. And the first thing that I really want to discuss is the psychology of postpartum depression and psychosis, because that's really what this whole issue boils down to. So, postpartum depression is a serious psychiatric disorder that is understudied both clinically and experimentally, as well as underdiagnosed. Shocker. Now, postpartum depression is incredibly common, and it's a complication of childbirth which negatively impacts the mother and sometimes can negatively impact the infant as well. And what I found interesting in my research is that postpartum depression can account for about 20% of postpartum deaths due to suicide. So this is obviously a pretty big issue because we're almost at a quarter, so almost 1 in 4 individuals who have postpartum will ultimately kill themselves. And while postpartum depression does not have its own category in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic criteria for mental health disorders, it is noted as a peripartum major depressive disorder. And the criteria for the diagnosis with major depressive disorder requires the consistent presence of at least 5 of the following: depressed mood, diminished interest or pleasure in activities, change in body weight, specifically more than 5% in 1 month, either up or down, insomnia, psychomotor agitation or retardation, that is the medical term, don't jump me in the comments, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, decreased ability to concentrate, or recurrent thoughts of death or suicidal ideation. Now, I don't know much about Lindsay as a person, but based on the 2 hours I've seen so far, we can extrapolate that she likely has the following symptoms: insomnia, fatigue, and suicidal ideation. Studies both in people and animals have also indicated that those with high levels of stress are more susceptible to developing postpartum depression. Some of the more recognizable symptoms of postpartum depression are as follows: a loss of pleasure or interest in things you enjoy, which includes sex, eating much more or much less than you usually do, anxiety all of or most of the time, this includes panic attacks, racing or scary thoughts, feeling guilty or worthless, consistent self blame, excessive irritability, anger, agitation, frustration, or mood swings, sadness, crying uncontrollably for extended periods of time, fear of not being a good mother, fear of being left alone with the baby, misery, which is a little bit, I guess, of a gray area in my opinion, but inability to sleep, sleeping too much, difficulty falling or staying asleep, disinterest in the baby, family, and friends, difficulty concentrating, remembering details, or making decisions, thoughts of hurting yourself or the baby. Again, Lindsay showed several of these, with increased anxiety, which was discussed by the prosecution and Patrick, as well as the defense, fear of being alone with the baby, inability to sleep, and thoughts of hurting herself or the baby. These were all expressed at different points in time. Some of the larger risk factors for worsening postpartum depression are as follows: a change in hormone levels after childbirth, which is honestly kind of inevitable, but previous experience of depression or anxiety, family history of depression or mental illness, stress involved in caring for a newborn and managing new life changes, having a challenging baby who cries more than usual, is hard to comfort, or whose sleep and hunger needs are irregular and hard to predict. Having a baby with special needs, for instance, premature birth, medical complications, illness, etc. First time motherhood, being a very young mother, or being an older mother. Other emotional stressors, such as the death of a loved one or a family member, or familial problems, financial or employment problems, isolation, and lack of social support. While most of these don't seem to apply to Lindsay, I would say employment problems and isolation are probably the biggest ones on this list. While both the defense and prosecution so far have painted Patrick as being present in both of his kids' life as well as Lindsay's, it's one thing to be physically present and another to be emotionally present. And that may be that, Patrick didn't really know what to do, say, or how to handle what was going on. It's not like anybody prepares to be in this type of situation. Now, what about postpartum psychosis? Well, postpartum psychosis is rarer than postpartum depression, as you may have guessed, and is said to occur in 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 deliveries. It also differs in its severe onset and symptomology. One thing that I found which was very interesting is a quote which says that women experiencing it may not show symptoms, as in, you may not be able to tell someone is experiencing any type of psychotic episode. PPD, postpartum depression, and postpartum psychosis differ in that the disturbing thoughts cause great anxiety and distress to mothers with PPD, but may not trouble those experiencing psychosis. In fact, while postpartum depression is underdiagnosed, postpartum psychosis is even more underdiagnosed, end quote. The main symptoms of postpartum psychosis include hallucinations and delusions, cognitive disorganization and confusion, anxiety, and sleep problems. Again, all things that we've seen mentioned and documented in this case. In rare circumstances, an affected mother may attempt to injure herself or their baby. In some cases, there is documented maternal suicide and infanticide, which is the core problem with this case. And I will present research discussing both of those things kind of at a later time. Now, what's interesting here is that some of the research indicates that women who have experienced either postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis have a 50% chance of developing a bipolar disorder, which is something that the defense brought up, saying that Lindsay was bipolar. This also complicates things because there's 2 types of bipolar disorder. Some say 5, but predominantly it's type 1 and type 2. And honestly, at this point, I can go down the rabbit hole of every psychological issue in this case if I truly, truly wanted to, but we'd be here for hours, and that's kind of a lot, and I would like to make tacos after this. So we're going to keep it relatively short. So, without getting into the weeds too far, I'm going to provide a very general overview of bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. And just because I don't expect everyone to know the difference between the two, that is why I'm doing this. So in general, bipolar disorder is classified as a chronic mental health condition that causes dramatic changes in mood, energy levels, and behavior. Pretty generic definition, kind of easy to understand. Bipolar 1, it really encompasses people who have severe and lasting episodes of both depression and mania. Depression is, think of like a valley, right? Very, very low. Mania is that super, super, super big like roller coaster high. You're up at the top of the slope. They experience periods of depression lasting at least 2 weeks, and at least one episode of mania that lasts at least a week or that requires hospitalization. It can be incredibly severe. Comparatively, people living with bipolar 2 disorder don't really experience mania. Instead, they experience what's called hypomanic episodes, which are less severe forms of mania. Basically, just slightly elevated energy levels. So, like a little kid roller coaster and not a big kid roller coaster. In general, it's not extreme or alarming. Additionally, those with bipolar 2 are able to more frequently maintain jobs and healthy familial relationships compared to those with bipolar 1. So, what does all of this mean? Well, it means that not only could Lindsay have had postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis, but also the onset of bipolar disorder. I don't know which one. And obviously, adding bipolar disorder into the mix would only compound the issues that are already there. And in one of the articles I was reading, they mentioned that sleep deprivation has been associated with an increased risk of postpartum psychosis, consistent with evidence that sleep disruption can trigger mania and psychosis outside the context of childbirth. Notably, a recent study found that women with bipolar 1 disorder who identified sleep loss as a trigger for manic episodes were twice as likely to have experienced postpartum psychosis during their lifetime, which we know sleep was a major problem for Lindsay at this time, something that both the prosecution and the defense have conceded. In an article by the Psychiatry Institute, they discuss some of the hallucinatory symptoms of postpartum psychosis, such as grandiose bizarre delusions encompassing paranoia, mood swings, audio, visual, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory hallucinations. So basically all 5 of your sentence, as well as confusion and disorganized behavior. They also note that postpartum psychosis occurs suddenly in previously healthy individuals, differing from other forms of psychosis. They also discuss how this psychosis is extremely dangerous because of its rapid onset. They also mention that part of why it may go undiagnosed is because women may fear discussing symptoms because there's a concern that it may lead them to lose custody of their kids. And this I can completely understand. This is honestly why a lot of people don't get help for the problems that they have, whether that is a mental health disorder or a substance abuse disorder. It is a big barrier. Again, really quick, all of these links are going to be in the description of my YouTube video if you want to go and read all of this as well. So, what about infanticide and female family annihilators? Great question. Lucky for you, I have done some digging. First and foremost, infanticide is the term used to denote child murder in the first year of life. Studies indicate that denial of pregnancy and a period of psychosis appear to be strongly associated with the act of killing one's infants. Adolescent mothers who have a history of mental illness are more likely to kill their infants than mothers 25 years of age or older. This would lead to the idea that what took place in the Clancy household was not infanticide, partially because only one of the children was within the designated age range, and Lindsay falls outside of the usual demographics for those that do commit infanticide. So what about female family annihilators? Well, familicide or family annihilation are terms that refer to a person killing multiple close family members in quick succession. The killers in these cases are almost always men. For example, the most recent case I can think of is Chris Watts. Rotten hell, I hate that guy. In these cases, extensive histories of domestic violence and abuse can be seen, including intimidation, emotional abuse, and psychological abuse. That said, there doesn't seem to be an indication of this within the Clancy family dynamic, either on Lindsay's side or Patrick's side. Granted, this is determined from an outside perspective and what's being presented by both the defense and the prosecution. Now, in many cases, the person committing the act will then turn the weapon on themselves. The weapons in these acts are guns about 90% of the time, which makes it interesting as to how this case is an outlier for that, because there's, as far as I know, there was no gun used. I don't know, maybe there's going to be some plot twist. I doubt it. But from what it sounds like, it was strangulation and not a firearm. And when guns aren't used, abusers may poison their victims, light the house on fire, or use mixed methods. Sometimes they will also use strangulation. And then 91% of the perpetrators of familicide are men. Some people may be saying this is an indication that Patrick clearly murdered everybody in the house. However, he has an alibi that was checked and he was thoroughly investigated. And there's also no indication of abuse on his end, like I said, or Lindsay's end. And then also, things that I will discuss later kind of refute that argument that the internet has decided to run with. Now, in a doctoral thesis I discovered, the author examines the research done on female family annihilators. Here is an excerpt, quote, Messing and Heron also found that many women killed their children as a result of a loss of domestic status, i.e., no longer the primary caregiver. Instead of trying to recreate their lives, creating new roles for themselves, women chose to escape their distress through violence against their children. Furthermore, it was found that these multiple child murders seemed to be carefully calculated and very rarely committed in the spur of the moment. End quote. What I find interesting about this is that Lindsay was she was the primary care provider for her children, and she preferred to stay at home rather than go back to work. So that seemed to subvert one of the documented motivations for why a woman may commit family annihilation. This study also notes that the research done on female family annihilators is microscopic compared to the research done on male family annihilators. This is true for most crimes, and the research predominantly surrounds men. The paper goes on to note that although mothers who annihilate their families are rare, they differ from other homicidal women and thus warrant more academic attention. Something of note within this thesis is information derived from a few studies, specifically that if the offender is characterized as having typically been a good mother and having adhered to her natural role as a homemaker prior to killing her family, she is viewed differently than an offender who is a poor mother who neglects and then kills her children. Ultimately, women who kill members of their family, especially children, are viewed differently by society depending upon media portrayal and public views. Both of these sentiments play a huge and, dare I say, critical role in this case so far, because by all accounts, Lindsay was an exceptional mother, which is why she's being viewed with a lot of sympathy and a lot of empathy, compared to if she had been an absent mother and somebody disinterested in her children. Additionally, there are prominent markers in the Clancy case that are related to female family annihilators in comparison to male family annihilators. For example, many of the women the thesis examined ended their own lives, while males don't usually commit suicide in response to family annihilation. In fact, this is particularly frustrating because motives are often known for male cases, but not female cases. Furthermore, many women do not kill their spouses, which is a common trait among male perpetrators that partake in family annihilation. This is because males often kill the children as a way of further hurting their spouse or partner. The thesis goes on to examine 6 cases with a female family annihilator. In all 6 cases, the mother successfully committed suicide, or really, they tried hard to do it and ended up living. Unfortunately, the thesis and associated study could not determine much due to a lack of documentation when it comes to female family annihilators, and unfortunately, there isn't much conclusive data surrounding this type of family annihilation. This is, in part, due to systemic misogyny, because research and crime don't really give a shit about women, and this is something that has plagued research and mental health for decades. But what this information allows us to see is that it does apply to the Lindsay Clancy case. First and foremost, the pathology makes sense, right? The triple homicide followed by a suicide attempt holds up to what little we know about female family annihilators. Not harming the spouse also checks out. The potential loss of domestic status doesn't quite match up with Lindsay as far as motivation goes. That said, the sentiment that female family annihilators pre-planned their crimes also appears to be upheld by available case studies. Of the 6 discussed in the thesis, only 1 was found not guilty by reason of insanity. This may be why the prosecution is angling their argument towards premeditation, because based on what we know, it is most often premeditated. For example, one of the 6 discussed cases involved a mother who drove to a bridge where she threw her kids into the river and then jumped in after them. The act of driving there, planning on how to get all the kids there, etc., was premeditation. That said, 4 of the 6 women were found to suffer from major depression at the time of the murders or were under the influence of substances. So that's something we have to take into consideration as well. So while we have a limited understanding of female family annihilators, what we do know appears to match up with Lindsay for the most part. For instance, it's also more common for female family annihilators to commit their murders within the home. In total, killing within the home, attempting suicide, mental health issues, not killing the spouse, and possible premeditation are all consistent with this case and the available research. The last thing I want to talk about is the method of suicide attempted by Lindsay. She used 3 primary methodologies: cutting, medication, and then jumping out of the window. In many instances, people who truly want to die will do everything in their power to accomplish that. Now, many people may say, well, why would you just not use a gun? And the truth is that most women commit suicide by less violent means, such as cutting or medication. There has been an increase with firearm deaths for women, but it's not nearly as high as with men. In comparison, men use more violent methods such as firearms or hanging. One fact that has always stuck with me since college was how there's a triad that often exists with suicides. There's that triad with serial killers. Well, surprise, there's a triad with suicide too. One prong is the ideology. You want to die, you want to commit suicide. The second prong is the use of substances. Many suicides include drugs or alcohol. And then the third prong is an underlying mental health issue or underlying mental health condition. People who successfully commit suicides are more often to have checks in all three of these boxes than those who don't legitimately. It feels bad to say like legitimately attempt suicide, but people that want to die that have all three checks in those boxes are more likely to succeed, is what I'm saying. Which is also something that we can see in Lindsay's case as well, right? She had the medication on board, she had underlying mental health issues, and she had the ideation. But how common is it for someone to use a mixed methodology? In a research paper published by the National Library of Medicine, they note that several important gender differences are common in people who die by suicide. They state that men complete suicide at a much higher rate than women and are more likely to commit suicide by gunshot wound to a vital organ. Men are more likely to die by hanging and carbon monoxide poisoning, while women are more likely to commit suicide by self-poisoning and drowning. Men tend to have a greater intent to die, while women use less violent methods to commit suicide. In the documented study, 31% of women who committed suicide used a self-poisoning method. However, there was no category for mixed methods. So there was no category in this study for anybody who tried more than one way to kill themselves. And to be honest, at first I was like, oh, aha, we've got something. But then I realized with a little more digging that this was probably just because I used the wrong terminology on my end in my search. Because what I learned is that there's actually a specific name for people who use multiple methods in one go to try and commit suicide, and it is known as complex suicide. What I learned is that there are two types of complex suicides. There's planned and there's unplanned. Planned is exactly how it sounds. The person wants to ensure they die rather than end up incapacitated somehow, and so they're doing everything in their power to make sure that happens. However, with unplanned complex suicides, a person may spontaneously swap methodologies because they're in the middle of doing one attempt and they're like, oh man, that's too painful, or they get scared and will switch to another. In the planned methodology, the individual will usually start with something less lethal or painful, like self-poisoning, before transitioning to something far more fatal, such as shooting or falling from a great height. One journal states less fatal methods, like poisoning or cutting, is combined with a second method, which is usually more lethal, like shooting, falling from a height, burning, or hanging. In another study titled The Forensic Characterization of Complex Suicides, they found that for suicides classified as planned, the most frequently reported causes of death were asphyxia, intoxication, whether that be drugs, substances like alcohol, and poisoning via toxic substances, so like acids, pesticides, things like that. Then, in unplanned complex suicides, they found that in 23.8% of cases, they did so that would be 25 out of 105 of the cases they looked at. The association between sharp force injuries and a fall from great height was observed, which again, very applicable to Lindsay's case. Then, in 111 out of 261 cases, also known as 42.5%, a positive history of psychiatric disorders, whether that be depression, psychotic disorder, and schizophrenia, or the presence of other conditions, were found. What this tells us is that whether planned or unplanned, Lindsay's actions are consistent with someone partaking in a complex suicide. And this indicates that complex suicides are more common than people realize. We're just not really exposed to them, with estimated percentages placing 1.5% to 5% of all suicides as being complex. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but if we do a little bit of math, it's a much bigger number than I think you're going to guess. So every year, approximately 720,000 suicides take place. We will use our complex suicide estimate as being in the middle, so about 2.5%. And that means that of the 720,000 suicides, approximately 18,000 people a year commit complex suicide. And honestly, that number was way bigger than I would have guessed. I was thinking maybe like 5,000, 6,000, something like that. But 18,000 is a lot. And the thing is this seems so weird to people is because we really aren't exposed to complex suicide. It wasn't something I was taught, and I have a degree in forensic psychology. So that's why a lot of people have flagged it or said it's a red flag, and why it hints at Patrick murdering Lindsay and all this other stuff. Bottom line is complex suicide is a very real thing, and the fact that it's categorized into planned and unplanned means that it is a pretty significant phenomenon. And really quick, what I do want to say is that if any of you guys are struggling with thoughts, things like that, I've been there. I get it. Please reach out and get help. People do care about you. I am very lucky that I had the family that I did and I did not do the things that I wanted to do. I am thriving. I am loving life. There is light at the end of the tunnel. This isn't for me to make you feel bad, but there is help out there. That's just my little soapbox. So, this is the conclusion of the episode. Throughout this, I have discussed the psychology of female family annihilators, the psychology of postpartum depression, the psychology of postpartum psychosis, how crushed up medication enters the bloodstream faster and whether or not lemonade has any impact on that, the psychology of suicide, and whether people use multiple methods in a singular attempt, aka complex suicide. Now, I am not here to tell you how to think or what to think, but I ask that you use the information I have presented to help come to your own conclusions. For me, a lot of what we discussed seems to be applicable to Lindsay and the murder of her children. So, what we're seeing in court isn't some random series of events or like some strange Criminal Minds episode. This stuff does happen. It will continue to happen. And if I'm being honest, the case really isn't being treated by the internet in the way that I would have hoped. It's actually somewhat concerning to me. In my opinion, this case should have spurred more talk pertaining to women's mental health, as well as research into, female perpetrators, because that is fundamentally lacking in the world of science and psychology and everything like that. Like, women just as a whole are not looked at enough compared to men. If a man suffers from something, they'll figure it out right away. But if you're a woman, oh well, we'll put it on the back burner, and if we figure something out, we figure something out. And so what I hope this episode at the very least, is it leads people to want to, I guess, not just investigate, but look at things more from a critical perspective and say, instead of, oh, well, what conspiracy theory can I come up with? Hey, why is it that I haven't heard of this before? Hey, why is it that people aren't talking about this the way that I think that they should? And then do their own research. I think that that's important. Unfortunately, this conversation hasn't really centered on how we can help women, but has instead turned into a witch hunt against Patrick Clancy, which is, I'm still having a hard time processing that, because in reality, what we've gone over today refutes the narrative that the internet is feeling, which is that Patrick Clancy killed his wife or tried to kill his wife and then killed his kids. Basically, all the signs and symptoms are there for what we have discussed. And the pathology of a female family annihilator, it makes sense. All of the boxes, in my opinion, are being checked to say, yeah, Lindsay did this. Now, the question obviously comes down to, was she in a mental health crisis at the time that this happened, or was this premeditated? I don't know. I can't give you that opinion one way or the other. At the end of the day, you are going to believe what you believe. That is perfectly fine. I just ask that you be respectful. And while I can't say, as I said, whether it was due to psychosis or not, the actions that took place in this crime are indicative of Lindsay being responsible for the crime. And quite frankly, what we need to be talking more about are the 3 beautiful little kids that lost their lives. It's hard to imagine what they could have offered to the world, who they would have grown up to be, what sort of sports they would have played, who they would have met, what their friends would have been, things like that. And they really are the ones who are the victims in this case. And they are not being talked about nearly enough. If you get the chance, please look at pictures of them and their beautiful little faces. They are so cute and so adorable, so lively and precious, and they deserve to be remembered. At the end of the day, nobody wins in this case. Nobody. Lindsay is going to either spend time in a mental institution with knowing that she murdered her 3 children, or she is going to prison knowing that she murdered her 3 children. Patrick is going to have to live with the fact that his 3 children were murdered. And at the end of the day, 3 children were murdered, and they are not going to get to grow up and live the life that they so rightfully deserved. So let's be a little bit gentle in the way that we approach this and stop pointing fingers at people who don't deserve to have fingers pointed at them. Let's be respectful, and let's remember what the actual loss is here, and that is 3 beautiful, innocent little little kids. That is all I have. If you guys want to stay updated, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Follow whatever platform it is. Like I said, my plan is to go live watching more trial footage on Saturday and Sunday, and try to update you guys with my research, opinions, things like that. In the meantime, please stay safe out there, take care of each other, and as always, stay psyched out.